Good morning, I'm Ian from Warrender Technical Solutions. How's everyone's week been? Today I'm going to be talking a bit about automation and what it actually means, some of the things that you should be cautious of, and some of the misconceptions people have around automation. My weekend was good. My daughter and I were in town yesterday in Newcastle, and it was the same time as the Lunar New Year, so there was the Chinese celebrations. We didn't get to see much of the Chinese celebrations. Not that we went down for that, but the crowds were absolutely heaving. And so unless you turned up really early, got at the front of whichever barriers there were, not that we saw any barriers, but wherever there were, you weren't gonna see anything, not for short people like myself. But it looked like a good time for those that could see, and that was good. This week is my wife's birthday week. And what that means is that we had a day at the cinema yesterday, and we got another day probably on Friday. Well, the kids were at school, so it's day cinema, but it's some time off. Yesterday we went to see Wuthering Heights. It's not my type of film. The main reason why I was there was for the company. Spending time with my wife is always important. I'm not saying I didn't like the film, but for me, the least interesting character in that interpretation of Wuthering Heights was Kathy. Not saying that Margot Robbie was sad at all. She did absolutely brilliant what she had. It's just I found her route through the film very predictable in parts, and even the prizes weren't surprises. I was far more interested in Nellie and Isabella, who were sidelined in the film. Found out afterwards, I've never read the book, by the way, but I found out afterwards that this is only half of the book, and that most adaptations of the book only focus on the first half, which I think is, at least for that version, disappointing, because I think there was more story to tell about the other characters and they just got missed out. So we focused on Kathy, and yeah, I just want to know more about the other characters. Is it going to make me look at other versions of Wuthering Heights or read the book? No, we're not quite at that level. It didn't interest me to that much to go and go, okay, what there's more. I looked at IMDb to see what it was saying about the film and things, but it's not going to suddenly change my perspective and make me go and check it out. I know it's one that people often cover in school, but for me, I'm currently going through Wheel of Time book series. That sort of fantasy and sci-fi books are much more up my street. And maybe in longer term retirement, it might be something I'll check out just to try and complete my book learning. But that didn't change that. Friday, we're planning to see Scream 7. We're massive Scream fans as children of the 80s and 90s. That came in at a certain time in our lives, my wife and I, in our dating lives as well. Hard to believe that this is its 30th anniversary. I say hard to believe, but my wife and I have been dating for 29 years now, so it's really hard to believe. But I'm looking forward to seeing if that franchise can get back to some of its heights. With the original writer now being writer and director, I'm hopeful that we're going to see something interesting. And seeing a match twice in 1 week for us is not usual. Our youngest is now almost 10, and so we're starting to get towards the point where we can start doing more things on our own. But at the minute, we're trying to fit everything in during school days mostly. But Friday, which is my wife's actual birthday, we're going to be going out for a meal. Going out to the cinema, providing we can fit there in the school day, and so it's looking forward to that. That's really good direction, and maybe in 3 or 4 years we can actually spend some more evening time out. We love the cinema. It's not always about the film. I enjoy seeing films that aren't my type, because it's about the experience and just widening that experience. And so I didn't mind seeing Wuthering Heights yesterday. It's just I found the characterization of Kathy being quite two-dimensional. The rest of the characters around her seem to have some depth, but we weren't focused on them. And that's deliberate. I know how that book is conceived, but I know it's not the best adaptation either. Automation. Back to work stuff. Automation is an extension of data transformation. Now, what I mean by data transformation is any business, any walk of life will have elements that transform data. And this isn't a modern, complex idea. Transforming data, the first documented cases we have go back about 6,000 years, where we've got tablets that show they were basically looking at livestock and saying this livestock is worth this other livestock, or this livestock is worth this amount of grain. And that's data transformation. It's nothing more complex than that. It's just you take something and then you transform it into something else. And as I said, we've been documenting it for 6,000 years. We've been doing it long before that. And so the idea that something is worth something else is that transformation of data. And when we were doing it 6,000 years ago, there would have been ways that people would have simplified it. Be that through experience. And so one of the best ways to simplify a process is by repetition. But if you imagine that when you're doing this 6,000 years ago, there would have been certain variations that would came up which wouldn't have met the exact tablet. So if 8 oxen was worth 9 bales of corn, that I'm not saying that's a natural one, but if it was something like that, and someone then comes up and says, I've got 4 oxen and 10 chicken, can I also get my corn? That type of thing would have needed some human interpretation. That would have needed some finessing in the interpretation of that data transformation. And when you're looking at that, what you're really doing is planning. And so if you have that fixed data transformation, so you know you have the expectation that when you go to market next spring that you need a certain amount of X to get a certain amount of Y, you can put that in your planning. So how much can this field give me of corn, and how much meat can that give me for the next for the winter? So when harvest comes and I reap this corn, how much meat can I get to process for the winter? So it's about planning. And if you go there and find that the tablets are now saying something slightly different because expectations have changed, that affects your planning. And this hasn't changed in modern business. This data transformation, this expectation that something means something else, this hasn't changed. Data transformation means a lot of different things. And so these days, a lot of data transformation is to do customer information. So if I get X amount of traffic, how much sales am I going to get? Google GA4 says I get this. If I get this particular audience, what can I get out of that audience? And so my key market, my key demographic is between, say, 25 and 40-year-olds, but my traffic is 18 to 25. That bit's high. Do I change the products that I'm advertising? Or do I market at them knowing they're going to be my target market in a longer period of time? All of which is data transformation. Where automation comes into it is taking that theory and basically doing some sort of a systematic element to that to speed up the process, to get to that end result faster. Now, this is nothing to do with computers. The Greeks were doing automation with their astronomical calendars about 2000 BC. There's some cogs they've found. I'm not going to try and butcher the name, but they found some cogs that basically do some automation with the calculations to work out certain astronomical events, which I'm assuming they'll be using for planning, for farming, for various other things. So automation isn't a new approach. Where we've got to with modern life is automation becomes a buzzword. AI is attached to that, and so if you want to automate your data analysis, you can get AI in there to look at that data and come up with answers for you. Where people are going wrong with automation is either in their original setup, their original assumptions, or the assumptions when it's live, when the automation's running. And those assumptions usually are around the idea that automations, if it works on X amount of situations, it's then infallible. You don't need to worry about it because you've proven it works, it's in there, we're just going to let it go. We've seen in the post office scandal in the UK here, Horizon, that those assumptions can be devastating in the wrong hands. Automations shouldn't be infallible in terms of they shouldn't not fail. What I mean by that, if a human's doing a job and a human's doing a repetitive job, and I mentioned last week that's something I really don't like humans doing, something completely repetitive over time, you've got the chance, you've got the ability for a human to spot something that doesn't match the automation. I say chance because if humans repeat something over and over again, something might go through that data transformation and they're not even looking at it because they are just literally focused on it. Type of things I'm talking about here are things like customer records. And so if you've got some customer records and you make an assumption on what service they need based on the inputs they provide, if the inputs they provide are significantly unique and significantly out the ordinary, out the standard, they might need a service that doesn't exist. They might need something that's also bespoke, that's out the standard. Now, humans can spot that, but also humans can look at the incoming responses and go, oh yeah, blah, 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 I've looked at that, I've seen that 1,000 times before, I'm going to assign them to this service, without actually reading between lines, and there's actually comments at the bottom and there's something unique about the individual that means they need a bespoke service. Automation can, if not done correctly, completely bypass that. And so if an automation fails positively, as in it allows the process to get to the end point without any changes to the automation, it means that you're going to miss that. The other alternative is a automation that fails negatively, and that's not a negative outcome. That is the automation saying, I've reached a point here and I do not know how to proceed. I need human intervention to come in and correct me, or to tell me what to do. And there's massive advantages in that. If the automation is set up correctly, if you have a log of those, you can re-finesse the automation to work with those. And so you can look at the automation and you can go, okay, I now got a new input which I'm going to put into my forms. I'm collecting data from the client. I'm going to create a brand new service. Or I'm going to say this is unique, but I know it's unique, and I'm going to let the automation send me a specific email saying you need to contact this customer and offer them a bespoke service. Failing positively, which is the type of thing Horizon did when they collected data shop side and they tried to marry that with the server side. This is when internet was poor and branches in certain parts of the country had no instant communication. That marrying up of data, if it always says that one bit of data is correct and it never asks the question about why there's errors on the other side, and it constantly does that, you can get to the point when even if everyone does everything correct on the Horizon shop side, if it's then being corrected, I say corrected loosely, if it's being changed by what the server thinks it should be and then sending that information and overwriting it, then it's going to come up with discrepancies that aren't real world, because the server side isn't real world. The server side is making assumptions, and if it's saying the server side is correct and the real world isn't, you're going to get problems. It's fairly obvious, but that's the next part of automation. You need to be able to audit it. You need to be able to look at your automation and go, is this doing what I expected it to do? Because it hasn't failed doesn't mean it's working perfectly. I'm working with a client at the minute, and we're going through various stages, and eventually we want to make a fully automated planning system. But for now, we're looking at the existing Excel sheets where people are manually adding in data, and there are lots of inefficiencies that manual element. But more concerning is at some point in the past, somebody has copied a formula from a row and has kept it as a fixed point back to that row. And so everything else is pointing at the data along that row as they go through the different dates. One reference is pointing at a specific row that happened 18 months ago. It's going to affect the data by about 15%, I think. So it's not like you'll look at it and go, that's completely out. It's something that when you're using in planning, you're going, the real world isn't quite matching my forecasting, and my forecasting was working up to a point. And then you're going to make lots of assumptions, and people have made lots of assumptions. Either the real world has changed significantly, so we've got different staff in, we've got different ways of working, maybe the processes have changed, and so maybe the numbers we've got here aren't quite correct, which are the assumptions that were being made. And when I brought this up, they were like, yeah, it was working. And I was like, to about summer last year, and they're like, yeah, we did have some change in staff last summer, and there were some things that were happening, and so yeah, there have been things, and so we do know that some of the efficiency numbers may need to change in some of the things, but we'll work that through as we're building this automation. And I was like, I'm not sure that's true, because actually what happened 18 months ago is you start referencing the latest data, the latest information, not everything, just in one component. And that lack of understanding the sheet, and that's no criticism of anybody, but that lack of, because it's a fairly complex sheet that people have added components to as they've gone through, means that that type of thing is really easy to miss. And so the first thing for me is, whenever I look at this, is I wonder what the intent. This thing you get at the end, this number, this dashboard, this graph, this data transformation from one thing to another, what is it that you actually want at the end? And then I can track back through the different automations that people have got in place, and I can see, one, is our assumption met? Are they really doing what they think they're doing? But also, is every single step in there correct? And are we at any point failing positively? Are we at any point taking that data and making assumptions that because an input has said something, that's actually what we've got at the end? So if any of that is intrigued you and you're wondering if any of your automation is failing positively when it shouldn't be, or if you're thinking, I've got a fairly complex Excel sheet here, and I think I know what it did, but it was set up by somebody else and I've been looking after it for the past year, or you're thinking, I'm doing lots of manual activities here, but I don't know if I would trust removing the human component, because that is a risk, removing the human component, because you know what you want from it, and so you're not sure what automation out there that can actually replicate what you do or give you the information that you need. Because you don't have to automate it to the end point, you can automate sections of it, and you can get an output that gives you information you can utilize. If any of that interests you, contact me, we can have a conversation. The first conversation is always free, and I'm always willing to have conversations just to aid people understand what the limitations, possibilities are, and also to remove some of those assumptions that people often have about these situations. While I've been here, the sun has started to rise. Last week, I completely loved editing this because I saw lots of activities behind me that I didn't even know existed. But the sun is rising. It is a brand new day. I'm going to go to networking as usual for Tuesday, but have a great Tuesday. Have a great week, and I'll be back next week. I'm probably going to talk about data validation next week, but I haven't done that this week because I haven't got around to doing the social media. Right. Have a good week. Bye for now.